The first thing I heard this morning wasn't a rooster or a radio. It was a guard's boots hitting the gravel outside my horse stall. The second thing was the smell. No matter how long we stayed here, the scent of old manure always rose before the sun did. They said this place was temporary, but when you live in a stable, every dawn feels like a reminder that someone decided you belonged with the animals. Tonight, you're listening to A Day in the Assembly Center Stables. You're listening to Stories from Camp, a nighttime series of first-person stories drawn from the Japanese-American experience during World War II. Japanese Americans confined behind barbed wire in 1942. Before they were sent to the more permanent concentration camps built across the desert and the plains, families were held in temporary detention centers, like this one, many inside converted horse stalls, still heavy with the smell of the animals that lived there before them. This story follows one man through a single day in those stables, capturing the sounds, the temperature, the closeness of the walls, and the quiet endurance of the people living inside them. Settle in, breathe, and let the story unfold. The morning began as a low murmur in the dark, the kind of sound that drifted through boards still stained from years as a horse stall. I woke before I meant to, listening to someone down the row search for a shoe, their movements scraping against the planks like they were in the room with me. A cough rose from another stall, thin and tired, and the sound seeped through the gaps as if the walls invited it in. This place didn't sleep, even when I did, even when I tried. I lay still for a moment, eyes open to nothing, letting the sounds arrange themselves. A man clearing his throat, canvas rustling as someone sat up too fast, the soft thud of a tin cup knocked from a crate. Every noise had a shape now. I could tell which stall they came from by the angle, the force. The stables had trained my ears the way the grocery store once trained my hands. Remembered the bell on the door? One ring and you knew if it was a regular or a stranger. Now you just know it is another prisoner. The air pressed close, heavy with the layered smells of manure, disinfectant powder, and the faint sour trace of too many people breathing the same stale supply. I pulled the army blanket back slowly so it would not stir more dust than necessary, and sat up, feet searching for my shoes in the narrow space between cot and wall. The boards under my soles felt dry and splintered, warmed by so many bodies lying above them in rows. Walk carefully. This floor has seen more hooves than bare feet. Beside me, my wife shifted once under her blanket, then went still again. She had learned to sleep in pieces, gathering rest whenever the noise in the row dipped low enough. I watched the outline of her shoulder in the darkness, the rise and fall of her breathing soft and steady. For a moment, the stall felt almost like a room, almost like the small bedroom behind the store where we used to listen to the streetcars instead of loudspeakers. Do not think of that room. If you hold both places in your head at once, something will crack. A thread of light slid between two slats above my cot, soft at first, then sharper as the sun edged upward. It caught the dust floating over our blankets and turned it into a pale river moving in slow currents. I rubbed the stiffness from my neck and listened as the row woke up in waves. A woman whispered to a child. A man muttered into his hands. Someone far down laughed once, short and unbelieving, then stopped. Another day, same boards, same smell, same noise. I reached up and touched the rough plank at my back, feeling the grooves worn smooth where the horses had rubbed against it years ago. The camp had thrown lime down and nailed up new plywood fronts, but the wood remembered. The smell remembered. You could feel it in the grain, that old restless life, replaced now with another kind of restlessness. Animals in, animals out. Only the labels change. In the next stall, the newlywed couple rustled awake. Their whispers slipped easily over the top of our wall, too low to catch every word, but clear enough in tone. Apology, reassurance, the brittle edge of someone trying not to cry again. When the springs of their cot creaked, my wife opened her eyes and met mine in the half-dark. We did not say anything. We had run out of fresh words weeks ago. Let them have their whispers. Let them believe this is temporary. You already know there is no such thing as temporary once the government builds walls. Somewhere down the aisle, a child began to whine, the early, thin sound before real crying. Shh, shh, came a mother's voice, patient but frayed. The sound rose, dipped, then broke into a full sob anyway. It reached into every stall because there was nowhere else for it to go. The plywood that divided us stopped eyes, not sound. You hear everything here. Arguments, prayers, dreams spoken in sleep. You know more about strangers now than you ever knew about your neighbors back home. I slid my feet fully into the shoes, feeling the grit that had already collected inside, and pushed myself upright. The cot complained with the low metal groan that echoed a few stalls down. I took my time, straightening the gray blanket, smoothing out each wrinkle as if it mattered. The army had given us each 2 blankets, a cot, and a number. The folding of the blanket is what I still controlled. This is what they cannot take. The way you do the small things. The angle of a folded corner. The decision to keep it neat. I reached for my jacket, hanging from a bent nail driven into the upright post. The fabric felt cool and stiff in my hands, still holding the crease from when I last took it off. I shook it gently, watching dust drift away in a small cloud, then slipped my arms through the sleeves. Outside the stall, I heard the soft swish of a broom. The boy who swept the aisle every morning had started his rounds. No one asked him to, that first week. He just picked up the broom. There is dignity in that. Or stubbornness. Sometimes they look the same. The swishing came closer, steady and rhythmic, pausing each time he had to move around someone's shoes left in the walkway. I stepped to the stall opening and looked out. The aisle ran in a long, narrow tunnel, broken at intervals by light slicing in through open doors at each end. Faces appeared and vanished, men bending to tie laces, women tucking stray hair under scarves, children blinking into the morning like they had woken up in a bad dream they now recognized. They will all pretend the first few minutes that the day is different, that today something will change. By the time the loudspeaker speaks, they will remember it will not. The boy with the broom reached our stall and glanced up briefly. He nodded once, polite, then lowered his eyes again and pushed the dust past our doorway. He could have been no more than 16, still narrow-shouldered, his camp number tag hanging crooked on his chest. The broom left thin trails in the dirt that were already filling in as people stepped across them. Cleaning a stable that can't be cleaned. That is a job made by someone who never holds the broom. From somewhere outside the stable building, a truck started, coughed twice, then settled into a low idle. A guard called out to another, words carried in short bursts that lost meaning by the time they reached us. I could picture them clearly. Uniforms, caps, rifles resting easy in their hands. They would drink hot coffee from metal thermoses while we lined up for watered coffee in tin cups. Do not dwell on what they have that you do not. You will spend the whole day staring at their hands. I stepped back into the stall and reached for the small crate that served as our table. On it sat 2 tin cups, a chipped enamel basin with yesterday's wash water gone cold, and a neatly folded towel. I dipped the towel, wrung it out, and pressed it to my face. The chill shocked me fully awake. Dirt and the faint sourness of sweat came away in brace streaks. I washed slowly, careful not to splash. Water was precious now, even when it tasted faintly of metal and standing pipes. Once you had hot water that rattled through old pipes in that little back bathroom, you complained when it ran out. You did not know what real shortage was. Behind me, my wife sat up, pulling the blanket to her shoulders. Her hair, usually pinned and neat, had escaped its confines during the night, strands falling across her cheeks. She brushed them back with quick, efficient fingers and watched me in silence while I wrung the towel again. We had never been loud people, even before this place. Now silence sat between us like a third presence, steady and familiar. If you speak, you might say something you cannot take back. Better to save the few gentle words you still have for when she really needs them. I handed her the towel without comment. Her fingers brushed mine for a brief second, warm and dry, before she took it. She pressed it to her face the same way I had, eyes closing, shoulders relaxing just a little under the touch of cold. The routine had become its own kind of comfort. Wake, listen, wash, wait for the day to declare itself. Routines keep people from falling apart. The guards have theirs, we have ours. Far down the row, a door slammed too hard against its post, the sound cracking through the building like a gunshot. Several people flinched. A child started crying again. Then, after a beat, the noise settled back into its constant, restless hum. Someone laughed nervously, as if to prove it was only a door. Only wood. Only wood. Only nails. Only fences. Only orders. That is how they like to count it. The light in the aisle grew brighter, pushing the shadows back toward the rafters. Dust motes turned golden as they floated through it. I could hear the clatter of metal from the far end where the mess hall staff had begun their own preparations, trays stacked, ladles rattling inside deep pots, a door swinging open on weary hinges. The day outside moved on its own schedule, indifferent to the fact that hundreds of us woke up in stalls. The sun still climbs, with or without you. That is almost comforting. Then the loudspeaker sputtered once, coughed static, and crackled into life. The voice that followed had become familiar, a distant male tone flattened by cheap equipment. Attention, attention. Breakfast will be served in the main mess hall starting in 30 minutes. Please form lines by block. Repeat, breakfast will be served. Here it is, the bell on the shop door. only now it calls cattle to feed. A small wave passed through the stables, blankets folded faster, shoes found their way onto feet. Voices rose in volume, patchy conversations starting up about nothing important. The weather, the rumor of fresh fruit in the kitchen, a possible change in work assignments. People needed to say something, anything, to prove they were still here. Words are like steam. They rise, they disappear, but for a moment they make the air feel warmer. I reached for the small cardboard tag hanging from the nail next to my jacket, the one printed with my identification number and family grouping. The corners had already begun to soften from handling. I slipped the string back over my head so it rested against my chest, a small square of authority-issued identity. My name still lived in my mouth, but everywhere else I had become this number. You are not foolish, you answer to it, but inside you keep the old name alive. My wife folded the blanket with deliberate care, squaring each corner, then placed it at the foot of the cot. She smoothed the surface once, twice, before letting her hand rest there a moment longer. Then she stood and tied her scarf, fingers working quickly out of habit. The motions belonged to another life, preparing to open the store, preparing to visit friends, preparing to go to church. Now they prepared her to step out into the aisle of a stable. Hands remember old purposes, even when the world assigns them new ones. Outside our stall, more people stepped into the aisle, some blinking against the light, others already alert and scanning the space as if this day might offer different news. The boy with the broom had reached the far end now. He leaned the handle against the wall and rolled his shoulders as though they ached. It was still early, and already he looked tired. The young should not look that old in the shoulders. For a few breaths, I stood at the threshold of our stall, 1 foot inside, 1 foot out, letting my eyes adjust fully. The boards, the dust, the faces, the narrow strip of sky visible at the end of the aisle, all of it arranged itself into the now familiar frame of our mornings. Behind me, I could feel the small weight of our stall, 2 cots, 1 crate, a basin, 2 cups, 1 life folded to fit. Do not count what you have lost. There is too much. Count what you still hold. Her, your breath, the habit of standing straight. I took a deeper breath, ignoring the mixture of smells that rose with it, and stepped fully into the aisle. Morning had arrived whether we welcomed it or not. Around me, the stables moved into motion, a long, low body stretching, adjusting, preparing to shuffle toward the mess hall when called. Get up, endure, pretend you have a choice, even if today you do not. I looked once more down the long row of stalls, memorizing the pattern of light and shadow, the outlines of people I barely knew yet saw more intimately than I ever had my neighbors on the outside. This was the shape of our days now, starting in the dark, filling with sound, ending in the same place we began. The loudspeaker crackled again in the distance, reminding us of the time. One day at a time, they say, as if the days are separate from each other. Here they stacked like crates. I turned back briefly toward my wife. She met my eyes, nodded once in quiet understanding, then adjusted the tag at her neck. Without words, we agreed we would go out together when the line formed. Until then, we would stand in the doorway of our stall and watch the lights slowly claim the stable. Hold your ground for these small moments. The day is long. You will need them. Chapter 2. Thin Walls, Thin Privacy. The morning settled into its full restlessness by the time I stepped back into the stall. The walls did little to slow the sounds around us. A couple 2 stalls over began another low argument, sharp whispers rising and falling like someone striking flint just out of sight. Their words blurred into one another, more emotion than language, but the tone carried clearly. A baby cried 3 times in short bursts before being hushed, the mother's voice soft but exhausted. Every sound folded into the next until the row felt like one long room filled with people trying to act as if they were alone. I sat on the edge of the cot and listened because there was no choice. When the newlywed husband apologized again for something I couldn't make out, I pictured the cramped space they shared. The bed too narrow for 2 people, the thin blanket they kept pulling back and forth. Privacy had become something we no longer owned. Even silence felt communal. When one person held their breath, it seemed the rest of us felt the pause. A child somewhere to my left started reciting multiplication tables, a small, determined voice fighting to stay focused. His father corrected him quietly, pronouncing each answer with tired precision. Their effort made the rest of the noise feel louder. Someone hammered a nail into the plywood above their doorway to hang a towel for shade, the sharp taps echoing straight through our walls. Dust shook loose with each strike, a light rain drifting into the air and settling across my shoes. The smell intensified as the sun climbed. Lime powder mixed with old manure, cooking into a sour warmth that clung to the back of the throat. I tried breathing through my sleeve, but it only helped for a moment. My wife moved behind me, sweeping the floor slowly with the small hand broom someone had given her. Each sweep revealed more dust beneath it, as if the building produced it faster than she could collect it. She paused occasionally to rest her wrist, though she never complained. By mid-morning, the whispers had turned to full conversation across the aisle. People talked about the rumors of moving us again, some insisting the stay here would be short, others quietly preparing for the opposite. I listened without joining. Words traveled too easily through the walls, and once a rumor started, it took root like a weed. I had no desire to be the source of the next one. When the couple next door began laughing, finally, briefly, it startled all of us. A few heads turned down the row, surprised to hear anything that sounded like happiness. The laughter faded quickly, but it left a faint warmth in its place. Even here, in this old stable, people were still trying to stitch together moments that felt like life. By the time the broom boy circled through again, brushing the aisle with his steady, almost meditative rhythm, the noise had softened. The row settled into a mid-morning lull, a fragile stillness held together only by the shared agreement not to disturb it. I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes for half a minute and listened to the soft sweep of the broom traveling further and further away. For that brief stretch, with the arguments finished, the baby asleep, and the dust floating lazily in the slants of light, the thin walls felt less like barriers and more like reminders that we were enduring this together. And though I would not have said it aloud, it gave me a small, reluctant comfort. Chapter 3. Inspection Hour. The quiet did not last. It never did. A sudden shift in the aisle, the scrape of boots, the clearing of a throat made louder than necessary, signaled what was coming. A few people straightened instinctively before the guard even appeared. By the time his shadow lengthened across the row, most of us were already standing. I stepped to the front of the stall and lifted my chin just enough to meet the light without bowing. The boards around me looked harsher in full morning brightness. Stains darkened the lower planks where the lime powder hadn't fully masked old manure. The plywood fronts the government nailed in place were thin, still showing the texture of the original boards beneath. No amount of scrubbing could erase what this building had been before they fit human lives into it. The guard walked slowly, inspecting each stall with the mechanical glance that treated people like inventory. He carried a clipboard tucked under one arm, though I doubted he wrote anything meaningful on it. His boots landed with a steady, deliberate rhythm. When he reached the stall beside us, the newlywed husband shifted to attention too quickly, nearly knocking over a tin cup in the process. The guard paused just long enough to let the awkwardness sink in, then moved on. When he reached us, I stood straight without stiffening, hands behind me, feet firmly planted. My wife placed her hands in front of her, the way she used to stand when greeting customers at the store. Her posture modest but sure. The guard's eyes grazed over us, past our faces, past our belongings, past the picture of our eldest son tucked into the corner of the crate. To him, we were dots in a column, nothing more. He stepped inside the stall just far enough for his shadow to swallow our cot. He scanned the small items we had managed to preserve, the basin, the folded blankets, the neat stack of towels. His gaze lingered a moment on our number tag hanging from the nail. Then, without a word, he turned and stepped back into the aisle. A breath left me that I hadn't noticed I was holding. A few stalls down, someone muttered something under their breath. Something bitter, something that earned a warning look from his wife. A child asked, "Are they done?" And the mother hushed him with the tired reflex of someone doing it many times a day. As the guard continued his slow march toward the opposite end of the building, the tension broke in small and visible seams. People sat again. Voices resumed. Fabric whispered as blankets were folded. A spoon clattered against a tin bowl. Life resumed its cramped shape almost immediately, as if we all agreed to pretend the interruption had not happened. My wife touched my arm, briefly, her fingers cool from holding the towel. "It's finished," she whispered, more to reassure herself than me. I nodded, though the feeling of being appraised stayed with me, like the cold imprint of a coin pressed against the skin. The guard's boots faded into distance, swallowed by the far end of the aisle. Only then did I sit again, the cot creaking softly beneath my weight. The stall felt smaller than it had a moment before, the air heavier, the light harsher. But the moment had passed and we had endured another inspection, another reminder that even our stillness belonged to someone else. Outside, a faint breeze pushed dust across the aisle. The smell of cabbage beginning to cook drifted toward us from the direction of the mess hall. Breakfast preparations had begun, as inevitable as the inspection itself. I let the sounds settle again, gathering themselves into the rhythm that guided our days. The morning resumed its slow, uneasy pace, and the stables continued breathing around us. Chapter 4. The Shuffle to Breakfast. The announcement faded, but the expectation it carried spread through the stables like a slow tide. People emerged from their stalls in ones and twos, adjusting jackets, smoothing hair, guiding children into line. No one wanted to be first, but no one wanted to be last either. The mess hall always felt rushed, crowded, and impatient, and the walk there had become its own ritual of resignation. I stepped out with my wife, falling naturally into the stream of bodies moving toward the long central aisle. The dust rose immediately under our feet, a salt cloud that swirled around ankles and settled again, only to be lifted by another step. The stables opened onto the yard in a narrow funnel of light, and as we approached it, the brightness forced our eyes into a squint. The morning sun had already burned through the fog, pressing heat into the ground. Outside, the line curled around the edge of the racetrack in a shape that reminded me of the long queues at the post office during holiday weeks. Only this line carried none of the anticipation. People spoke in low voices, if at all. A few of the younger boys nudged each other, joking quietly in English, gestures small enough to avoid drawing attention. Their restlessness felt like the last piece of normal youth they had managed to smuggle into this place. Rows of guards stood at intervals along the path, rifles resting casually but visibly. They watched without expression, their eyes skimming across us the way a shopkeeper looks over a display window, checking for order, not connection. One of them wore sunglasses so polished that the racetrack reflected clearly in the lenses, the empty course curving away behind us like a reminder of movement we were not allowed. The smell of breakfast drifted toward us long before we reached the building. Boiled cabbage, thin miso soup, slightly burnt toast. The same combination as yesterday and the day before. The scent clung to the air with the persistence of something that refused to change. The closer we moved, the warmer it became, steam escaping through the kitchen vent like a tired sigh. When we finally reached the front of the line, a cook ladled cabbage stew into my tin plate with a practiced flick of the wrist. The liquid sloshed to one side, nearly spilling over. I stepped aside to let my wife receive hers, and we walked toward one of the long wooden tables. Every bench was already half full. People sitting shoulder to shoulder, bowls in hand, elbows touching elbows. The noise inside the hall was sharp. Metal spoons scraping metal trays, children whining, a few voices raised in complaint before being hushed. We found a narrow space between two older men, both of whom nodded politely without lifting their eyes. My wife set her tray down carefully, her movements precise, despite the crowd. We ate in silence, as most people did. The food went down quickly, not because of hunger, but because lingering made the whole experience feel heavier. Every bite carried the taste of repetition. A few tables away, a mother tried convincing her little girl to drink the soup. The child shook her head, lips pressed tight, tears brimming. Her mother whispered urgently, almost pleading, but the girl resisted, turning her face away just as the spoon approached. After a moment, the mother sighed and set the bowl aside. The gesture was small, but it felt like a story of its own. When we finished, we slid out of the benches and returned our trays to the bin near the exit. A cook glanced inside, frowned at the leftover cabbage, and muttered something to himself. Outside, the air felt cooler, the morning breeze brushing the heat from our faces. People drifted back toward their stalls in loose patterns, some walking alone, some speaking quietly with friends or neighbors. On the way back, I looked again at the racetrack stretching empty under the sun, the long curve of it forming a quiet loop around the center. Once, horses had run there, fast and free, their hooves pounding into the soil with purpose. Now, it served as a border, a ring of emptiness around a place full of stalled lives. The thought stayed with me as we re-entered the stables building, swallowed abruptly by the familiar smell and dimness. Breakfast was over, but the wait of the day was only beginning. Chapter 5. Work Assignments and Avoidance. The stable settled into a restless quiet after breakfast, the kind that comes only when people resign themselves to the long stretch of hours between meals. I sat on the edge of the cot, tracing the grooves in the wood with my thumb when the loudspeaker sputtered again, its static crackling like a small storm trapped inside a metal box. The voice announced the day's work assignments, names and stall numbers read with the flat cadence of someone who had repeated them too many times. Men stepped into the aisle as the list continued, leaning in to hear better, some hopeful for a task to occupy the day, others praying they would not be called. Work crews meant moving in the heat, lifting, scrubbing, taking orders from men who seldom knew or cared what the labor demanded. But they also meant a few hours outside the stall, a few hours of doing something rather than waiting. My name had not been called yet, though friends had warned that skipping work too often made the guards look twice during inspection. I sat listening as a clipboard man walked down the aisle, gathering volunteers, though we all understood the word volunteer had a flexible meaning here. He was a civilian employee, thin, with a mustache that looked like he trimmed it with impatience. His eyes moved quickly, not unkind, but distant, trained on the next task before finishing the present one. When he reached our section, he paused and glanced at me. "Afternoon yard crew still needs bodies," he said softly, as if offering me a choice that wasn't fully a choice. I nodded once, not eager, not resigned, just nodding. He made a quick mark on his clipboard and continued down the row. My wife watched the exchange without speaking. She folded the towel for washing, smoothing its corners with slow, deliberate care. The gesture felt heavier than it needed to be, as if she were pressing all the unsaid fear into neat squares. I did not have the heart to tell her not to worry. She had grown too experienced in watching over the years to stop now. A few men around me began discussing their assignments for the day. One had been sent to help dig refuse pits, another to carry supplies from the warehouse, another to scrub the latrines with buckets of cold water. Their voices wove through the aisle, joking lightly, but without much humor. The joking, I'd learned, wasn't for laughter, it was a defense. A thin shell over the bruised dignity we all carried. I stepped out into the aisle, stretching my shoulders. Dust drifted as my sleeves brushed the boards. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the ever-present manure residue, creating something sharp enough to sting the nose. The broom boy passed by again, dragging his line through the center of the walkway. He nodded at me, respectful, wary, and moved on. For a brief moment, I considered trying to avoid the assignment altogether. If I remained in the stall, if I looked busy enough, maybe they would skip over me when the crew assembled. But avoidance never truly worked here. The guards remembered faces better than we expected. And besides, sitting in the stall all afternoon was a different kind of punishment. The walls felt thinner in the heat, the air thicker, the hours slower. So I accepted the truth quietly. Work would come, whether I sought it or fled from it. Better to meet it standing. When the clipboard man returned to post the final list, he nailed it to a beam at the end of the aisle. People gathered around it, shifting on their feet, some relieved, others grim. I walked toward it with steady steps, scanning the rows until I found my number neatly printed beside yard crew, 1 p.m. My wife reached my side, her expression calm but her eyes darker than usual. She said, "It will not be hard work." She could have known. "It is only sweeping," I answered, as if that made it lighter. She nodded once, accepting the words without believing them. For the next hour, the stable moved in its uneven rhythm, children playing quietly in the corners, mothers arranging what little storage they had, men sitting on cots trying to hold their minds steady. I watched the sunlight widen across the aisle as the day pressed onward, flattening patience like heat on metal. Work was waiting for me, for all of us, and the row braced itself for what the afternoon would demand. Chapter 6. Noon Heat Across the Track. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to turn every surface inside the stables into a slow-burning plate. The air thickened, carrying the warm smell of manure, lime powder, and sweat in a single unmoving layer. Even standing still felt like work. When I stepped outside to breathe in air that wasn't trapped between wooden boards, the heat struck me like a weight placed across my shoulders. The ground shimmered faintly, the dust rising in thin spirals with every footstep. Voices softened as the temperature rose. People sought shade wherever they could find it, leaning against the slanted shadow of the stable roof, gathering beside the water barrels, or sitting with backs pressed to the cool side of the mess hall wall. Children who earlier had run back and forth now clung to their parents' hands, their energy drained by the climbing heat. Even the guards looked restless, adjusting their caps and wiping their foreheads, though they tried not to show discomfort. I walked slowly along the edge of the track, watching dust lift and fall like breath. Once, the ground here had been smoothed beneath hooves, packed down by horses running full speed, riders leaning with purpose toward the finish line. Now the track sat silent, encircling us like a ring drawn around the map we had never wanted to enter. A harmonica played somewhere near the barracks. The tune drifted across the yard in wavering lines, bending slightly each time the player inhaled. It sounded familiar, though I couldn't name it. Something from the radio, maybe, or a tune someone played on a street corner years ago. The melody wound through the heat like a thread of relief, small but persistent. I found a patch of shade near the side of the building and leaned back against the wooden siding. The boards were warm but not scorching. From inside, I could hear the muffled rhythm of sweeping, the broom boy continuing his rounds with the patience of someone who had learned not to rush. The repetitive sounds almost lulled the noise of the camp into something steady, something I could rest inside briefly. My wife joined me a moment later, bringing a small cloth soaked in cool water. She pressed it into my palm with a quiet firmness, the way she used to hand me coins at the store to place into the register. I held the cloth to the back of my neck and felt a soft shock run through my spine. We stood together in silence, not speaking because the heat had already taken the strength from unnecessary words. Around us, life continued its pared-down routine. A group of younger men played cards on the grounds. The deck was worn and softened from too many hands. They fanned themselves with their shirts between turns, teasing each other in low voices. Nearby, an elderly woman paced slowly along the fence, counting her steps as if the repetition gave her a measure of control. A boy carried 2 tin cups from the water station, walking carefully to keep from spilling. His mother watched every step he took, as though the smallest misstep held greater consequence now. A gust of wind rose unexpectedly, lifting dust into the air and pushing it across the yard in a shimmering sheet. People turned away, shielding their eyes, coughing into sleeves. The harmonica faltered for a moment under the sudden grit, then continued, the melody slightly roughened but still intact. When the wind died, the heat returned with full force, pressing down on the yard once more. The sun was relentless today, as though testing how far we could bend before breaking. I watched the shadows shift as the hour approached 1. The time for my work crew drew nearer. The knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone, heavy, unmoving, but familiar. The heat would make the work slower, harder, but standing still in the stables with the walls closing in would have felt heavier still. I folded the cloth and handed it back to my wife. She nodded once, the way she had when she agreed to things she did not want but accepted. Then she placed her hand briefly on my arm, a gesture small enough to not attract attention, but strong enough to anchor me for a heartbeat. The sun blazed high above us, indifferent to everything below. The yard shimmered, the harmonica played, and I stepped away from the shade, preparing myself for the work that would carry me through the next stretch of the day. Chapter 7. Letters that cannot be sent. The heat had pressed the morning into a slow, heavy silence by the time I returned to the stall. My wife rested on the cot, her eyes half closed, the towel folded neatly beside her.
I sat at the crate we used for a table and pulled out the small stack of camp-issued paper, its edges already softening from humidity and handling. Writing had become my way of holding on to the pieces of life outside the barbed wire. But lately, even the act of beginning felt like lifting a stone. I smoothed the top sheet and uncapped the pencil stub. The lead was worn down to a blunt point, barely sharp enough to make a clean line, but I had learned to write with whatever the day gave me. At the top of the page, I wrote my eldest son's name, each stroke slow, deliberate, as if carving something into wood. Seeing his name written down steadied me for a moment, then came the harder part: what to say. I tried to begin with something simple, or "we are managing here," or "the weather grows warmer each day." But the words crumbled under the weight of what they avoided. How could I describe the smell of the stall, the dusk holding our blankets, the thin walls carrying every argument, every sob, every whispered fear? How could I write about the lime powder clinging to the floorboards, or the way the guards' voices reached us before their shadows did? I wanted to shield him from the truth, but hiding it made the sentences ring false. I wrote half a line, paused, then crossed it out. Wrote another half, then stopped again. The pencil hesitated above the page like a held breath. Behind me, someone hammered another nail in the aisle, and the vibration traveled through the wall into my hand. It broke my focus. The graphite skidded inking an accidental mark across the margin. I placed the pencil down and rubbed my forehead. Outside our stall, a few children ran past, their laughter thin and fleeting, swallowed almost immediately by the width of the building. A conversation drifted from somewhere near the entrance. Two men debating whether the army might move us again, whether the rumors of new barracks meant a minor stay. Their voices carried the practiced caution of people who had learned not to hope too loudly. I looked back at the blank portion of the letter. My son had always trusted me to tell the truth, even the uncomfortable parts. But this truth felt too large, too shaped by humiliation. I didn't want him imagining his parents waking each morning in a horse stall, lining up for cabbage soup, sweeping someone else's dirt under a guard tower's gaze. The pencil rolled slightly toward me, inviting another attempt. I picked it up again, writing slowly, "We are doing our best. Your mother is strong. To not worry for us." The words were thin and incomplete, but they were all I could offer without betraying the steadiness he needed to hear. I wrote a few more lines, carefully, cautiously, skirting the edges of the truth without letting it spill fully onto the page. But when I reached the final line, the one where I meant to reassure him that we would see each other soon, my hand froze. The page blurred. The promise tasted like something I could not afford to speak. I tightened the grip around the pencil until it left an imprint on my fingers, then slowly loosened it. The letter was only half a page long, a handful of sentences, each one carrying more gaps than substance. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling the heat around my temples, the stale air washing back into the stall in quiet waves. The lead on the paper looked faint, almost shy.
Chapter 8: The Friction Between Neighbors. By early afternoon, the heat and the stalled hours began wearing down the thin patience that held our road together. The walls had always carried every sound, but now they carried something sharper, an edge that had been slowly building since morning, ready to break at the slightest touch. I heard it first in the clipped conversation between two men across the aisle, their voices rising and falling like a saw cutting against stubborn wood. One accused the other of skipping his turn in the shared cleaning rotation. The other insisted he had worked twice the day before. Their words tangled, quick and defensive, each one striking harder than the last. It wasn't truly about chores. Nothing inside the stables was ever only about chores. It was the closeness, the heat, the loss of everything that once made people feel like themselves. All of it pressed against our ribs until any small disturbance felt like an insult. People began drifting toward the sound, subtle at first, then less subtle. A few leaned out of their stalls to listen. Some whispered speculation. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking what was happening, and she pulled him back with a firmness that left no room for questions. Arguments had become a kind of warning bell in the stables. You watched, but not too closely. You listened, but pretended you weren't. The two men stepped fully into the aisle now, facing each other with tense shoulders, their words spilling faster. Sweat ran down their temples, catching the light. Their hands hovered near their sides, not fists yet, but close. One man's wife stood behind him, urging him to stop, though he didn't seem to hear her. The other son tried to step between them before being pushed gently aside. I moved toward them, not because I had authority, but because sometimes age was the only shield people still respected. My joints protested with the heat, but I walked steadily, keeping my voice level as I asked them to step back. Neither wanted to look at me. They kept staring at each other, their anger flickering, fed by weeks of confinement. For a long moment, no one spoke. The aisle held its breath. The dust floated in the sunbeams like suspended ash. Finally, the older man exhaled sharply and stepped back, shaking his head but lowering his voice. The younger man muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to be heard, but not loud enough to escalate. A small ripple of relief moved through the watching crowd. People returned to their stalls slowly, as though convincing themselves the danger had passed. As they dispersed, the tension did not fully leave the air. It thinned, but it clung to us like humidity. Arguments inside the stables never finished cleanly. They left faint cracks in the trust that held us together. They reminded us that we were all stretched thinner than we ever admitted aloud. Back inside my stall, the shadows had shifted. The smell of dust and heat pressed more heavily against the wood. My wife looked up from the corner where she was folding clothes and asked quietly, "Is it settled?" I nodded, though the word settled felt too neat for what I had seen. Outside, the aisles grew quieter again, but the quiet felt strained, as if every voice in the row now spoke more carefully. The stables had a way of amplifying every weakness, every fear. Tempers frayed faster here, pride bruised easier. The walls absorbed all of it. As I sat on the cot, the echo of the argument drifted across my mind, not sharp anymore, but lingering. It was a reminder of how thin our boundaries had become, how easily the heat and confinement pulled the worst from even the gentlest people. By the time the broom boy passed our stall again, brushing the aisle in slow, steady strokes, the earlier friction had settled into the dust beneath his broom.
Not gone, just buried. For the moment, waiting for the next long day to loosen it again. Chapter 9. Afternoon assignment in the yard. When the clock reached 1, the heat inside the stables had grown thick enough that even breathing felt like an effort. I rose slowly, brushing dust from my sleeves, and stepped into the aisle. A few other men gathered near the entrance, each with the same resigned posture, shoulders lowered, mouths set in thin lines, eyes narrowed against the brightness waiting outside. No one complains. Complaints didn't lighten work, and they spread faster than dust in this place. The yard opened into a wide stretch of sun-bleached earth. A supervisor stood waiting beside a stack of brooms, his clipboard held loosely at his side. He wore a short-sleeved shirt rolled up at the elbows, revealing arms reddened by the sun. When he called out the names on his list, we stepped forward one by one. He handed me a broom without ceremony, the handle rough from use, bristles worn unevenly where others had swept before me. We began near the edges of the walkway, where dust collected in thick lines. The work required no instruction. We knew what to do the moment the broom touched the ground. Push, gather, lift, and repeat. A rhythm built itself from necessity rather than intention. Dust rose in faint plumes with every stroke, drifting into the sunlight in soft arcs. It settled on our shirts, our necks, our hair, making each one of us look a slightly older with each pass. Above us, the guard tower cast a long shadow on the ground. 2 guards stood inside, rifles resting against the railing. Their faces were obscured by the glare, but I could feel the weights of their watching. It was not hostility. It was not compassion. It was the steady, impersonal gaze of men whose work required distance. I swept without looking up at them, focusing instead on the narrow line forming slowly beneath my broom. Around me, the other men worked in near silence. One coughed intermittently, the dry sound scraping his throat raw. Another paused to wipe his forehead with a sleeve already damp with sweat. A younger man worked with a force that bordered on anger, pushing the broom as if the dust had insulted him personally. When he stopped for a moment to catch his breath, he muttered something about wanting to feel useful. No one answered. We all understood. The sun slipped behind a thin cloud for a brief moment, cooling the yard just a little. I straightened my back, rolling my shoulders to ease the ache that was growing between them. The respite lasted only long enough for us to notice it. Then the cloud passed, and the light returned stronger than before. My broom handle grew warm in my hands. The air shimmered. We worked in slow, methodical lines, moving toward the center of the yard. Every few minutes, the supervisor walked along the edge, checking progress, jotting something down without expression. He wasn't unkind, just indifferent. His authority didn't need to be loud. It existed simply because he held the clipboard and we held the brooms. As I stepped away from the line of tools, my legs felt heavier, my arms slow and stiff, but somewhere beneath the fatigue, a muddled steadiness took hold. There was something grounding in the act of labor, even labor assigned without choice. The sweeping carried its own strange clarity, carving through the day in long strokes. On the walk back to the stables, a faint breeze rose from the west, lifting the heat just enough that the air felt breathable again. The harmonica player had returned, his tune drifting between soft, uneven notes. The melody wasn't cheerful, but it was sincere. Something living in a place made to feel lifeless. When I reached the doorway of our stall, the shadows inside felt cool enough to step into without hesitation. My wife looked up from her sewing as I entered, her eyes quietly scanning my posture, my shoulders, the dust clinging to my clothes. She said nothing, but her gaze carried the question anyway. "I'm fine," I said softly, easing onto the cot. And in the slow rhythm of my breath, I almost believed it.
Chapter 10. Evening at the Mess Hall. By the time the late afternoon bell crackled across the camp, the heat had begun to ease, but the fatigue it left behind clung to every muscle. I dusted off my sleeves and stepped outside our stall, joining the slow current of bodies moving once more toward the mess hall. The air had cooled just enough to let people lift their heads instead of hunching forward against the sun. Still, no one walked quickly. We had all used our strength already. The mess hall loomed ahead, a long rectangle of wood and metal that held the sounds of hundreds of voices. As we approached, the familiar scent floated toward us. Cabbage boiling in large vats, rice steamed thin, and miso soup that smelled more of hot water than broth. The mixture rose from the kitchen like a memory repeating itself because it had nowhere else to go. Inside, the heat returned immediately, trapped by low ceilings and too many bodies pressed into too small a space. The clatter of metal trees struck the ears first, sharp, uneven percussion that echoed off the walls. The line moved slowly, everyone holding their plates with resigned precision. When my turn came, a cook ladled stew to my tray with a practiced, weary motion. The cabbage leaves floated on top like pale islands. I stepped aside from my wife and found us a place at a long wooden table. People squeezed onto benches already full, pulling in elbows to make space. Across from us, a teenage boy tried to hold a conversation with his father, but his voice kept disappearing beneath the noise. The father nodded absently, his eyes fixed on some point past the crowd, as if searching for something he had misplaced before the war even began. The room filled with small sounds that carried stories. Spoons scraping the bottoms of metal bowls, children complaining that the soup was too hot or too bland, adults insisting quietly that they eat anyway. Somewhere to my left, a young mother moved with slow, practiced gentleness, trying to convince her toddler to take one more bite. The child pushed the spoon away, tears already forming, frustration heavy in the tiny furrow of her brow. The mother whispered reassuring words, her voice barely audible under the clamor. I watched her for a moment, struck by the tenderness she held onto despite everything here trying to wear it down. My wife ate beside me without hurry, each movement measured, each bite deliberate. The heat glowed faintly on her cheeks, but she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had brought into every room she had ever entered, even this one. She caught my eye briefly and gave a small nod, the kind that said she was managing, even if the food and noise offered little comfort. Around us, conversations shifted in waves. Rumors floated across the table, passed from one person to another. Talk of new barracks being constructed, whispers about transfers to different camps, speculation about mail delays. None of it had confirmation, but rumors spread because hope needed something to cling to, even if it was flimsy. When we finished eating, I gathered our trays and carried them to the return bin. The cook standing nearby eyed the leftovers with a kind of resigned disappointment, as though he had hoped today's stew might inspire cleaner bowls. He muttered something I couldn't catch and returned to stacking dishes. We stepped outside into the cooling evening, and the difference hit immediately.
The breeze brushed across my face, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and eucalyptus from far beyond the camp. For a brief moment, it smelt like the outskirts of Los Angeles in late summer, the kind of evening air that used to drift through our store when we propped open the door. The memory arrived uninvited, but warmed me nonetheless. People lingered near the entrance, reluctant to return to the stables just yet. Some stood in small groups, comparing notes about the day. Others walked slowly toward the yard, savoring the thin layer of comfort the cooler air provided. Children played near the fence line, their laughter sharper now that the heat no longer pressed against their lungs. My wife and I walked together through the softening daylight. The shadows lengthened across the ground, stretching toward the rows of stalls like dark pathways guiding us back. My legs ached from the afternoon work, and my back protested every step. But the breeze lightened the weight enough that I could breathe without feeling the air trapped inside me. When we reached our stall, the interior felt cooler than it had all day. I sat on the cot, letting the evening seep into my skin, easing the fatigue. The mess hall's noise still echoed faintly in my ears, but it no longer felt overwhelming, just distant reminders of the lives pressed together in that single room. The day was far from over, but dinner had given the camp a moment to gather itself again. A small reprieve, a chance to breathe before the night made its own demands. Chapter 11. Nightfall in the Stables. Evening settled slowly, like a curtain drawn 1 inch at a time. The last of the sunlight slipped through the cracks between the boards, laying thin, slanted shapes across the aisle. The air cooled just enough to release the tension in people's shoulders, but not enough to erase the heaviness of the day. Night inside the stables carried its own distinct rhythm, one built from quieter voices, softer movements, and the awareness that every sound still carried farther than anyone wanted. As the sky darkened, families began returning to their stalls. Footsteps echoed lightly down the aisle, each pair stopping at its numbered doorway, each voice lowering into something gentler and more fragile. The newlywed couple next door spoke in whispers again, their tone softer than in the morning, marked now by apology and tiredness. A child somewhere toward the front of the building recited a prayer with hurried breath, as though racing the fading light. Another child laughed once, a thin, high sound, before being hushed. Inside our stall, I lit the small, permitted lantern, its flame trembling in the draft that crept through the gaps in the boards. The light cast long shadows on the walls, exaggerating the rough texture of the wood. My wife sat beside me, mending a seam in her sleeve with slow, careful stitches. She bent close to her work, eyes narrowing in concentration, hands steady despite the dimness. The repetition seemed to calm her, the way the broom calmed the boy who swept the aisles. Outside, the sounds grew more distinct as the crowd movements thinned. A harmonica drifted in from somewhere near the back row, the notes rising and falling in a wandering melody, something wistful, something half forgotten. It wasn't cheerful music, but it wasn't bitter either. It was the kind of tune someone played when they weren't sure if they were trying to comfort themselves or someone else. A man 2 stalls down began speaking in a low voice, perhaps telling a story to his children. His sentences floated through the walls in soft threads, not fully forming words but carrying the shape of reassurance. Another person coughed repeatedly. The dry sound echoed through the quiet. The cough belonged to an older woman, someone who had grown thinner since arrival. Her daughter's voice followed in soft murmurs, gentling her through it. The privacy was thin, but so was the loneliness. The walls did not allow anyone to forget they were surrounded by hundreds of others living parallel versions of the same night. I stretched my legs slowly, letting the tension drain a little from my back and shoulders. The cot creaked beneath my weight, the familiar groan of metal reacting to movement. I watched the lantern flicker and thought of the many nights before this one, the ones filled with the hum of our store's refrigerator, the soft clatter of late deliveries, the distant comfort of streetcars rolling past.
Life then had been noisy in a different way, and the noise had not pressed so tightly against the ribs. The broom boy passed one last time, dragging his broom lightly down the center of the aisle, with much less force than he had used during the day. His strokes were tired and uneven, but he continued until he reached the end. When he propped the broom against the wall, he lingered for a moment, perhaps appreciating the quiet he had helped to shape. Then he slipped into his own stall, leaving behind a thin trail in the dust. Conversation faded into murmurs. The harmonica stopped. The lanterns dimmed one by one, as families prepared for whatever sleep the night would allow. A guard's footsteps crossed outside, the gravel crunching beneath his boots in a slow, measured pace. His shadow flickered briefly through the cracks, then disappeared again. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the mixture of sounds wash together. Voices, footsteps, the soft rustle of blankets settling. Night inside the stables was not peaceful, but it held a different kind of honesty, stripped of the day's forced activity. Here, in the dim light, people revealed the parts of themselves they hid under the harsh sun, their tenderness, their fears, their attempts at hope. My wife set aside her mending, blew gently at the lantern's flame to lower it, then rested beside me. Her breathing joined the quiet chorus around us. I listened to it, letting the steadiness of her presence anchor me as the darkness thickened. Nightfall inside the stables did not promise rest, not truly. But it offered a brief pause, a moment where the day's burdens loosened their grip, even if only by a fraction. And in that small gap between exhaustion and sleep, something like resilience took shape again. Quiet, but persistent, preparing us for another morning we had not asked for, but would meet all the same.
Chapter 12. What endures after lights out? When the lanterns dimmed further and the last bit of daylight surrendered to the dark, the stable settled into a deeper quiet, not silence, but a kind of collective exhale. The boards creaked softly as people shifted on their cots, adjusting blankets, finding whatever comfort they could in the cramped space. The air cooled little by little, becoming easier to breathe, though the residue of the day, dust, heat, the faint trace of cabbage, still clung to every surface. Lights out came without fanfare. One moment the row glowed dimly with lanterns flickering behind thin plywood walls. The next, the shadows thickened into something close to night. Through the cracks in the boards, faint lines of moonlight cast thin silver strokes across the aisle. The darkness softened the hard edges of the stalls, but it sharpened the sounds. Every whisper traveled, every sigh felt nearer. Somewhere down the row, a baby whimpered, then quieted as its mother whispered against its hair. A man recited a prayer under his breath, each word rising and falling like a low tide. The older woman who had been coughing earlier let out another dry, rattling fit. Her daughter stroked gentle circles on her back, murmuring reassurances in a voice worn thin. Their silhouettes moved gently behind the boards, shadows that carried more tenderness than the day ever allowed. I lay on my cot with my hands folded over my chest, staring at the rafters barely visible above me. The structure creaked occasionally, settling into the cool air. Small gusts of wind slipped through the cracks, carrying with them faint scents from beyond the camp. Dry grass, distant eucalyptus, something almost like the outskirts of home. Each smell arrived in a whisper, a reminder of a world that had not disappeared, even if it had closed itself off from us. My wife breathed steadily beside me, her shoulder rising and falling under the thin blanket. Her presence grounded the stall, anchoring it against the restlessness that often pressed in after dark. In the early weeks, she struggled to sleep in the stables, waking at every noise, gripping my arm whenever her footsteps passed too close. Now she managed better, not because the place had grown kinder, but because endurance had woven itself into her bones. Beyond our stalls, someone hummed a tune, soft, slow, barely more than vibration. It took me a moment to recognize it as the same melody the harmonica player had offered earlier in the day. Without the instrument, the tune felt more fragile, held together not by breath, but by memory. It drifted through the walls, threading itself into the quiet like a thin line of warmth. The noises blended into a single low chorus of life, sleeping, shifting, waiting. The thin walls did little to separate us, but in the darkness, that closeness felt less intrusive. It reminded me that even here, in a place built from wood meant for animals, people found ways to care for one another, to soothe, to endure. I thought of the unfinished letter in the crate. The lines I had written earlier weighed heavily on my mind. I wanted to promise my son things I wasn't sure of, that we were strong, that we would remain whole, that this place would not claim the best parts of us. But promises felt fragile in the stables. The truth was quieter, harder. Survival here was not one choice, but 1,000 small ones, repeated every day. As I listened to the row breathing in the dark, something inside me steadied, not hope. I was too old to mistake endurance for hope, but something adjacent, a steadiness made from shared hardship, from hearing the heartbeat of so many lives through thin, porous walls. We had become a kind of reluctant community, shaped not by choice, but by necessity. A guard's footsteps crunched along the gravel outside, passing slowly, then fading. The stables remained still for a long while afterward, as if waiting for the night to settle fully,
before daring to sleep. When the air finally eased into something close to calm, I let my eyes close. In the dark, the walls felt thinner than ever, but so did the distance between us. Every breath around me carried the same truth. We would wake to another morning we had not chosen, but we would wake together. And that, in this place, was something that endured long after lights out.
Thank you for listening to this story. If this journey spoke to you, you'll find more chapters across our channel, exploring the daily life, resilience, and human truth inside the Japanese American concentration camps, otherwise known as internment camps during World War II. Every view helps us keep these narratives alive with care and accuracy. Rest well, and we'll see you in the next story. Thank you for spending a few moments with us. This is the first and a developing archive of Japanese American wartime sleep stories. If you'd like to continue learning in this quiet way, please like the video and subscribe. Our growing library is ready whenever you need it.